Welcome to the Seasteading Today podcast. Today I'm talking with Mitchell Suchner, founder of ArkPad in the Philippines. Welcome back, Mitchell.
Hello, Carly. Thank you for having me back. I'm happy to be talking about seasteading again.
Great. Yes. So you've been very busy since the last time we
Oh
talked.
yeah.
I think you hosted a big event to launch your ArkPad C model. So will you tell us a bit about what that model is and your launch event?
Yeah, so back in September of 2024, we had the grand opening. We actually launched it in July or August. I believe in July is when we launched the ArkPad C prototype in Boracay. I think I've talked about this during the last episode. I might not have, but Boracay is kind of like a tourism-based resort island in the Philippines. It gets about 1.5 million visitors per year. And so our ArkPad C was launched there. And immediately after being launched, so we had this grand opening. We had a bunch of like local people in the government to come and see it. We had the Coast Guard come and walk around on it. We had a bunch of our employees from different islands around the Philippines. Like a month and a half later, there was a typhoon that came through, which typhoon is just the word they use over here for hurricane. It flipped over a few cars, it knocked down some buildings on the coast, but the ArcPad survived. So it did very, very well, and they are currently available for sale. So if people want to reach out to us through a website or send me an email, I'd be happy to talk with them. The newer version of the ArcPad is going to be primarily using fiberglass rather than aluminum. So we're kind of focusing on that now. We're actually going to be building two more for our Reef Resort on Samo Island, which is to the south of Boracay.
So with that typhoon, do you know how it would be compared with the category? We have the category system here in the U.S. for hurricanes. Do you know what level it would be?
So over here in Asia, they use the term signal. So I think this was like a signal three, if I remember correctly. So that would be like a cat three in America. So I want to say it was about a category three.
That's excellent. And so it survived, but did it? I mean, was there damage on the home, or like is it the sort of thing where if someone was living there that they would have evacuated, or would they be safe staying on the arc pad during a storm?
Well, while it was going on, it was rocking back and forth like crazy. So anything inside the house got knocked over. You'd probably want to evacuate if a Category 3 hurricane came through. You would not want to stay in the house, but when you come back to it later, it will still be there and everything will be fine. Don't leave like wine glasses sitting on the counter. Those will probably get knocked over, something like that, you know. But in terms of like a real estate investment, in terms of buying a floating house, buying an arc pad, you're not going to lose it, especially if it's in a near shore. It was in kind of a protected area when the typhoon came through as well, so that definitely helped.
That's excellent. I mean, that's the first seastead structure we know that's been tested in a storm like that, and so it's great to know that it's survived and that it's possible to have floating homes on the water that can survive a storm, because that is probably the first question that we get asked when we first start talking to someone about seasteading. They're like, "Wait, what about these storms?" And so to know that there is a home design that can survive a storm, that's excellent. That's a huge milestone. So you mentioned
Yeah, I
already. Oh,
absolutely agree.
yeah.
Go
So
ahead.
you mentioned already the Reef Resort. So I did want to talk about that. So your Reef Resort is going to be made up of Hexa farms, right? So the Hexa farm is the vessel, design. Is that correct?
So in our quest to have the lowest maintenance, lowest cost floating real estate possible while still keeping it safe, we basically came up with two designs when we first started this 2 years ago. The first design was the ArcPad. The second design was the Hexafarm. And the Hexafarm originally was a fish cage. You might remember I was talking about a polyculture fish cage. So it's a fish cage that can grow fish, lobster, shrimp, seaweed, all inside of these kind of little self-contained chambers with like an underwater ecosystem. That structure we have in the water. We had our first fish harvest with that also back in September of 2024. So about 5 months ago now. And what we did with the Reef Resort is we decided, okay, we want to build a full floating resort of these floating houses. We want to open it up for tours. We want to invite people out to come and stay here. What's a more cost effective way for us to do that? The ArkPad's or adding smaller floating houses like studio units to the Hexa farms. So what we decided on is I mentioned before we're going to be building two more ArkPad's, right? So we're going to have two ArkPad's that are going to be available for rent in the Reef Resort, and 15 of these glamp houses. So the glamp house is the name for the floating house that attaches to the Hexa farm. I know that's kind of complicated, but basically we took the fish farm. We have now the fish farm is the underwater part, and then the overwater part we turned it into a floating resort. So now the Hexa farm being a fish cage, it's not meant for rough seas. It's not meant to go through typhoons. It would not survive those conditions. However, because of where we put it in a very, very protected area, which is actually south of the hurricane zone, it won't be affected by hurricanes or typhoons. So we're basically building our floating resort outside of the area that is hurricane prone.
Right, and that's Samal Island in
Yep,
the
Samuel Island. That's like the
okay.
furthest southern major tourist hotspot in the country, I'd say.
Right, and then there is a coral reef nearby. That's why it's called the Reef Resort.
Yeah, so it's called Kittapong Sandbar. It's like half sandbar and half coral reef because as soon as you walk off the sandbar, it's kind of surrounded by corals. So that's the area where the resort is currently being built.
Tell me what the plan is for visitors coming to the Reef Resort. How is their vacation going to look?
Well, there's already a tourism industry there. They've got island hopping boats, which kind of pick people up and carry them around to like different beaches around the island. There's also a couple of very smaller islands around Samal Island. One is called Vanishing Island, which it's got mangroves on it, and then at high tide it's completely submerged under the water, and then at low tide you can walk on it. So that's Vanishing Island. They've got one called Wishing Island. They've got at least about a dozen or so different coral reefs in the area. So the first thing that people will do when they go to Samal Island is they'll get like a little water tour of the whole area. And that's a popular thing. Another thing is because there's so many coral reefs, they have a lot of scuba diving. Actually, my parents went scuba diving in Samal Island, and they were there for a sardine run. So I don't know if this is seasonal or not, but there was like several thousand sardines that were kind of swimming below them, and they formed like a blanket. So you could look up and you could see the water above you because you're scuba diving, so you're like 10 feet underwater. You can see the water above you, and you can see the sardines below you. It's like you're kind of caught between these two layers. So it's a very cool experience. Um, so there's jet skis. There's one difference between Samal and Boracay is in Boracay they have like a little walled off area where you're allowed to use a jet ski, and in Samal you're allowed to take the jet ski wherever you want. You can just take it all over the place. So it's a lot more free when it comes to renting jet skis, which I like. So yeah, Samal is it's got enough of a tourism industry. It's mostly built around the beaches and the coral reefs as it is right now.
So the Hexa farm, because it has six sides, right? So in the center of this structure, you have the underwater fish farm, and then on each side of the Hexa farm, you can have on one side you can have two of these glamp homes, right? We'll share some pictures on our social media, but just to describe a little bit. So
Yeah, yeah.
two glamp homes on each side. So that would be 12. I mean, if you wanted to fill it up, you could do 12 glamp homes on each side on each Hexa farm.
Yeah, because I call it a cell. So there's six cells, or there's six sides around the hexagonal fish farm, or around the hexagonal fish cage. Fish cage is a hexagon, six sides to the hexagon. Each side has its own because it's kind of like two concentric rings. So there's one hexagon on the inside and then one larger hexagon that wraps around the whole thing on the outside. Between each of the set of walls, and if people see the picture, they'll know what I'm talking about here. Between each of those boundaries, you can have two of these little white glamp houses. And so each of those glamp houses are meant to be like a studio unit. So you've got a bed, you've got a small bathroom, you got your little kitchenette, your dining table, all of that stuff. We're actually buying the furniture for the first unit right now that's in the water, so we're kitting that out currently. So anyways, yeah, you can have a maximum of 12 per hexafarm if you wanted to buy your own. If it's part of the resort, we're going to cap it at about 8 units per hexafarm. And the reason is because we're going to use that extra space as kind of like an open air restaurant venue, and then cover that with a layer of solar panels. So you're getting solar electricity, so you're providing power when you're off grid. And then in addition to that, you're also, yeah, you're basically, we're making better use of the space than just putting up houses.
Great. And then so a visitor coming to stay at the Reef Resort, do they get to interact with the fish farm?
Oh yeah, they can feed the fish. They'll be able to feed the fish. They'll be able to swim with the fish in the fish farm, which is kind of fun. I've done it. They'll be able to do a lot of things. We talked about letting people fish, like catch fish with a fishing pole, and that's definitely a thing that we can do. I'm kind of leaning towards us just renting out a fishing boat, taking people out into deeper waters, and having them catch the big fish out there, because that would probably be more exciting for a lot of people. But letting them catch fish in the fish farm also makes a lot of sense, because not everyone wants to get on a boat and go miles out to sea. Some people are afraid of that, so they'd rather stay in the resort.
So you can go catch a fish in the little fish farm and then go back to your little glamp room and cook it in your kitchenette.
Oh, we can cook it in the restaurant. We'll have a restaurant. We have a chef that is already with us, so he's making the menu right now. So if you catch your own fish, we'll definitely cook it for you.
Excellent. And what else is growing in the farm? Can you say more about that?
No, at this stage, we're primarily going to be having two things: milkfish and rabbit fish. We do have some lobster in limited quantities, but they take 2 years to grow to adulthood. And so we aren't going to be focusing on growing as many of those, because frankly, you can wild catch a lot of lobster in the area. So it's just easier to wild catch them most of the time. Seaweed we will be growing. We're not growing it yet, but we're going to be growing seaweed. We're probably going to end up growing mussels or scallops as well. I'm leaning towards mussels because they're a good filter feeder, and there's a lot of stuff in the water they can clean out. It makes the water nicer, clearer for tourism as well, because people want to see that nice clear water. Um, so mussels would probably be on the menu. Uh, but yeah, when it comes to the seaweed, there's three different types of seaweed that are human edible and popular in the Philippines. The first one is called guso, and then gulaman, and then lato. Those are the three different types. Guso is kind of stringy like a pasta. So the way that I'll eat it is I'll have like slices of tuna, like tuna steak, and then you put it on a bed of guso and you kind of eat it like pasta and meatballs. I just like to have it that way. Filipinos like to put a lot of vinegar on it, so then it's kind of sour pasta. But it's guso is really good. So we'll definitely be growing that. We'll definitely be serving that to people as well.
That sounds excellent. So, and the Hexa farm, you have a philosophy. We've talked a little bit about the farming philosophy of wanting to have circular agriculture. So, is that determines sort of what you're going to be growing in the farm? Is that it's an ecosystem that's supporting within the Hexa farm?
Oh yeah. So the goal with the rabbit fish, in fact, is rabbit fish will can subsist almost entirely on a diet of biofouling. So biofouling is like the barnacles, the algae, the sea sponges, anything that gets onto the net of the underwater cage that holds the rabbit fish inside of it. Anything that grows on that cage is a type of biofouling. And especially small sea sponges and algae, rabbitfish will eat those like crazy. And so the idea is we're going to lower our stocking density of rabbitfish, not to be such at an industrial scale, but to be at a low enough scale that because of their diet, they can primarily eat the things that the underwater ecosystem grows. And then we aren't introducing new foods or like growth hormones or anything like that into the environment. Instead, we're just letting them kind of coexist within this ecosystem that we've built for them, that has a higher than average amount of nutrition because of the way we've designed the structure, but not so much that we can stock them at like 10 times normal density, which is what you normally see with industrial fish farming. So when it comes to the milkfish, we'll probably stock them at a higher density, have to kind of add feed because they need that for their diet. But at least half the fish that will be growing, which is the rabbit fish, they're going to be grown in a more natural, kind of organic way. So that's already a part of it. Another part of it is, again, going back to the mussels. The mussels will eat other planktonic matter and biofouling that kind of floats in the water column. So that helps with the ecosystem. And then the last thing is the guso, the seaweed that I talked about, because that can add in more oxygen into the water, into the underwater environment. That can help the fish as well, because sometimes you'll get periods where there'll be low oxygen, like there's an algal bloom, something like that. And then this seaweed is not some types of, like, especially microalgae, can both consume oxygen and release oxygen into the water. Guso only releases oxygen, so it's never going to consume it. So that helps to make sure that they don't run out of oxygen as well. So there's a lot of different aspects of it. But the goal of this technology, and indeed of this whole resort, is really to kind of say, can we take a population of humans? It doesn't have to be the same humans all year long, but can we have humans living on a platform in the water for months or years and producing enough food to feed themselves? And so while we're doing it from a tourism and kind of more luxurious perspective, the idea is that the technology can then be translated directly into something that can be used in the open ocean hundreds of miles from land, where now you'll be able to be totally self-sustaining. So that's the end goal, is we want to help with that kind of activity.
Okay, so now you have a model in the water right now, right? And you said you harvested your first harvest in September.
Yes.
So what is the harvest cycle? Like what do you like when you're when you introduce fish to the fish farm, you're introduced like they've been cultivated somewhere else and then you introduce them at a certain point in their life cycle. How does tell me about that cycle?
Yeah, so that's the thing is so when it comes to, I'll talk about the milkfish first, because there's two types of fish, the milkfish and the rabbitfish. When it comes to the milkfish, I'm not as familiar. I believe that what happens is you have, so some inland farms will dig out big freshwater ponds on land, and they'll have like breeding pairs of milkfish, and they will just populate an entire pond just with two or three breeding pairs with, thousands and thousands of baby milkfish. They'll get them up to a certain size, like maybe 1 inch long, 2 inches long, 3 inches long. Then they'll scoop them all up and they'll send them in these big plastic baggies filled with water. They'll send them out to these fish cages in the ocean, because normally milkfish are born in fresh or brackish water, and then they work their way out to the ocean and they get acclimatized to the salt water, and then that's when they grow very large, and they eat a lot of plankton as well, and they also will eat some biofouling, but not as much as rabbitfish. So that's the way that it works with the milkfish. So anyways, that's the way that it works with the milkfish. With the rabbitfish, they always spawn near the mouths of rivers. So rabbitfish are always born in shallow, brackish water. They don't go into fresh water quite so much the way that milkfish do. So you can't raise them in inland ponds, which is what they do a lot of the time with milkfish, as I said, because once you're on land, there's a lot more industry, it's a lot more developed. So actually, milkfish are more common for that reason. But the rabbitfish, the adults, will go in near the mouth of a river. They'll spawn several thousand baby rabbitfish, and then those rabbitfish will kind of hide in like moss blankets and seagrass blankets, and maybe sometimes among coral and stuff like that, where the water is very brackish, like mixed with fresh and salt water. And then as they get bigger, they also go out to the pure salt water, and that's where they start eating a lot of like algae and like baby barnacles and things. Um, so going back to how do we get the milkfish? We just buy it from a farm. But when it comes to how do you get the rabbit fish, they have like these big ponds that they dig that are not freshwater ponds. They're like ponds along the coast, and they dig a channel that goes out to the ocean. So when high tide comes in, all this water rushes in, and if you're near a river, a lot of baby milk, or a lot of baby rabbit fish will come in with this water, and then they'll harvest up all of those baby rabbit fish, and then they'll sell it to these cages out in the salt water. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, in both cases, they're getting the baby fish from land in one way or another, and then they're moving it out into the ocean. So what we probably want to do is either, if you're going to go in the seasteading, properly seasteading, you need to either find a species that is pure saltwater, or you need to find a way to kind of farm and properly raise these baby fish, like rabbit fish especially, are great because they eat everything. You need to find a way to do that in pure salt water without needing to be near a river, presumably.
Right. Now, is that something that you could build like a little fish nursery in the space of a glamp house? Like, could you build something if your Hexa farm was just focused on one or two people living there and the whole focus was to grow as much as you could? Is would that offer enough space to do it above the surface?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, well, above the surface, I was going to say you could do it below the surface. You could replace the house. You could just put a cage underwater, and then you could have the adult rabbitfish in there mating, and then releasing their spawn. But then you're saying it would be in pure salt water. So what you're thinking is we get brackish water. Okay, so you're thinking we'd have a brackish water tank on a platform above the rest of the farm, and then you'd produce your young. You could do it that way. You could have like a brackish water tank, but it would have to be sealed. You'd have to have like little air pumps going to oxygenate the water, because if you just open it up to the open world and you're out in the middle of the ocean, you'll get like this saltwater spray that'll eventually splash up on top of this tank. It'll make the brackish water more and more salty until eventually it just becomes salt water. And then I don't know if it's healthy, if the baby rabbit fish would actually survive that.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Now, similarly, when you're growing seaweed, I think some seaweed you would spawn in a protected area until it reaches a certain growth level, and then you put it out into the waves and the salt water. Is that is that the seaweed that y'all are growing too, or can you just throw a bunch of seaweed into your hexa farm and then it flourishes?
We can throw a bunch in the hexafarm and it does just fine. No, ours doesn't really need a protected area, so that's the seaweed's nice. The seaweed's great. Now, don't get me wrong. There's some issues with the seaweed, like certain diseases that'll try to kill it off, but those are actually more common when you're near land. If you took a seaweed farm and you moved it 100 miles out in the middle of the ocean, not only would the seaweed be absolutely fine, all you need to do is just tie it to a rope, or tie it to some, have like a seaweed line going through your farm, or just dangling out in the water like 100 meters away from your farm, or whatever, right? You just tie the baby seaweeds to that rope, and they'll grow into adults with no issues. They don't need brackish water, they don't need fresh water, they just stay pure salt water. And really, again, the farther from shore you are, the healthier they're probably going to be. A deep sea seaweed farm would be a great idea, and you could probably grow massive amounts of seaweed, probably faster than normal as well. Just keep it at the surface so it gets plenty of sun. Keep it floating. You'll be fine.
And with seaweed too, if you were growing enough that you would be selling some of it, you have to process it, right? Like you have to have space to like lift out of the water, harvest, and then some seaweed varieties need to be dried in a very quick time period before it rots. Is that the kind of tell how do you process the seaweed that you'll be growing on the Hexa farm?
Right. So again, going back to the kinds of tropical seaweeds that we're working with, a lot of people are more familiar with kelp, and kelp is not a true seaweed. Kelp is the stuff that they wrap sushi rolls in, and that stuff is supposed to be dried, like you're saying. Seaweed doesn't need to be dried. You can take it directly off the line right of the ocean. You're supposed to wash it with fresh water to get the salt off, but I mean, honestly, salt water's not going to kill you. So you could just rip it right off the line and eat it if you wanted to. Most people, they're going to take it off the line. They're going to rinse it with fresh water. They're going to chop it up because, imagine like a 3 foot long pasta noodle. Like that's a bit much. They're going to want to cut it into smaller strands, and then they're going to eat it. So it really requires minimal preparation, minimal work in harvesting. And
All right. So when you're harvesting seaweed every 6 weeks or so, when you're harvesting every 6 weeks, that means that's incorporating the idea that that seaweed is going to continue to grow and you're going to harvest it again in 6 weeks. Like you're not starting from scratch every 6 weeks.
Well, so the way that the seaweed works is, unlike with most land-based plants, only part of it is edible. With the seaweed, some seaweeds it's like 90% is edible, and then the anchor or the stem is not edible. But some of it, it's like it's all edible. So actually, with guso, I don't quite remember if it's 90% edible or 100% edible. But the point is, you can chop off 90% when you go to harvest it, and yeah, you can leave like a little stump, and then that'll regrow. Another option you have, if you want to do it this way, is you just stagger each line in the water, so that one is going to be ready for harvest next week, and the next line is ready for harvest in 2 weeks, and then in 3 weeks, and then in 4 weeks, and every 6 lines you kind of repeat the cycle, right? So it's like you could either stagger it So you can be continuously harvesting every week, or you can just kind of cut off, only harvest what you want to take and then leave enough to regrow is another option. Probably what you want to do is a combination of those two things, because when you harvest, you don't necessarily want to harvest an entire line and then take stems or little bits from another line and then kind of replant them on the first line. That'd be a lot of extra labor. So yeah, going back to what you're saying, you probably, and right now we're just using a regular knife, but you can probably get like a little, I've seen like little circular knives where it kind of like wraps around the rope and you cut it in such a way that it always leaves the stem intact so it can regrow. But we don't have those knives yet, but I'll look into it.
Cool. Now, how much revenue do you expect a Hexa farm to generate? Like, if someone wants to be an independent farmer, would you compare the potential income from a single Hexa farm to that of a traditional fisherman in the same area of the Philippines?
Well, so in the Philippines, fish farming is a lot more profitable than being a traditional fisherman. The fish farming is actually much higher end. It's much better. Even the seaweed farming is much better for obvious reasons, as you can imagine. Having a rice field compared to having a seaweed farm, the seaweed farm tends to make a lot more money because you can harvest more frequently. The stuff that you harvest is almost entirely sellable. There's not a lot of like rice husks. A lot of weight goes to waste, so you're harvesting things that you can't sell in the market. So in the Philippines, the Hexa farm is more profitable than most local industries. However, when you're looking at international markets, I like to look at real estate markets because originally we built these to be floating houses, and the farming was just kind of like an add-on. Like, okay, it needs to be able to produce food. We're going to be hundreds of miles out, stuff like that. So the idea was we looked at what kind of rate of return do you get from the rental market, and how does that compare to the rate of return that you'll get from this Hexa farm. And so in the rental market, you'll get somewhere usually between about 5% and 10% return if you buy a rental property. Whereas with this Hexa farm, you're probably looking somewhere between 25% and 40% annually. So it's actually a very good profit margin when you operate it. When it doesn't get, as long as the weather conditions are decent. If you get a typhoon, it could kind of mess things up. But most of the time, 25 to 40% is a very solid return.
Sure. Now, and you're looking at that rental income from, would you like tourist renters or more longer term renters? When you're saying that number, what were you thinking of?
When we were designing the resort, we wanted to look at the rate of return on owning a room in the floating resort. We want that to be higher than the rate of return you would get from owning a land based rental property in a traditional real estate market. In the traditional American real estate market, you probably are going to get about 5% to 10% return if you buy just a standard apartment building, apartment block, and then rent those out. That's or rental house near a city. That's what you're getting is 5% to 10% on your investment of buying the house. With the resort, it kind of changes because there are so the floating platform that the house. I'm talking about the Hexa farm here. So with the Hexa farm, the floating houses that we add, the 8 floating houses per Hexa farm, are on a fiberglass pontoon platform that will last about 30 to 50 years without maintenance. But then there's some parts of the house individually that need to be maintained as often as once every 8 years. Like the some of the parts of the walls of the house have to be actually replaced once every 8 years. So what we wanted to do is we said, okay, let's imagine that we need to guarantee a full return on investment for the entire house within less than 8 years. So we're going to assume that we want to pay off the entire house after 8 years, because after 8 years, you're probably going to have like a 2 or 3% maintenance bill, anyways, on replacing some parts. So if that's the case, can we reach that 8 year return? And we sat down and we looked at, what are the coastal properties renting out for? What are coastal resorts charging in the area and in the rest of the Philippines and the north as well? And we kind of worked out a pricing scheme where I would expect a full return on initial investment after about 6 years. So if you buy it, it'll pay itself off after 6 years, and you won't have the first maintenance bill until about 8 years. So that's the idea. So with a 6 year rate of return, I think that's about a 15% return. I think somewhere around 15%. So that still beats out the traditional real estate market.
All right. Sure. Now, for our audience who's sitting in their homes on land, in the United States or Europe or South America or Australia, what are the different ways that they can get involved with ArcPad?
So the best thing that you guys can do right now, and what we want people to do because they're buying at a discount, is go to arcpad.co website, click on Reef Resort up at the top of the page, and buy a part of the Reef Resort. Buy in, buy some ownership, become an owner either of a full unit, or we're selling fractional ownership as well. So you can own half a unit or an eighth of a unit or a 1/32 of a unit, however low you want to break it down, right? The idea is we want to lower the barrier of entry to own floating real estate. So if you're listening to this podcast, if you're interested in seasteading and you have just a couple $100 burning a hole in your pocket, you want to be invested in the seasteading movement and help us advance this technology, come and buy part of the Reef Resort and get a return on that investment as well.
Wonderful. And then when will the Reef Resort be open for visitors?
So our original anticipation was to open in April. It is now February. There's still a good chance we'll open in April, more likely May, but sometime between April and May of 2025, it will be open to visitors. We'll have our big grand opening ceremony, just like we did for the ArkPad C. And several months after that, we'll be adding ArkPad Ds to the resort. So when the resort opens, it'll just be the Hexa farm units. But a few months later, maybe towards the end of the year, we're also going to add ArkPad's to the resort. So we're going to be displaying all of our seasteading technology. It's all going to be out there. You guys can come and snorkel, scuba dive, take a jet ski and drive around the resort. We're going to have boat races. Hopefully, I'm trying to organize a big boat race to happen. So it's going to be great. So if you ever want to go to the Philippines, again, just go to arcpad.co. Within the next few weeks, we'll probably have a place where you can book a reservation to stay in the resort. So reach out to us there as well.
Wonderful. Anything else that you want to share about ArcPad?
I think that's about it. I want us to make a positive impact on the world. I want us to make a positive impact on the seasteading movement. I know we've been around for a few years now, but after a long time of hard work, all of our technology is really coming into fruition around the same time. I'm hoping that this is going to inspire and drive forward a lot of new seasteaders and help the movement to take off 10 times what it was in the past.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mitchell. It's always inspiring to hear how much work you've been doing and how much progress ArcPad has been making. So we'll be looking for that reservation page on your website, arcpad.co, and I'll be sharing that link in our show notes and on our social media. So thanks again, Mitchell, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carly.
All right. The Seasteading Today podcast is produced and hosted by Carly Jackson. Send feedback and questions to podcast@seasteading.org. To support our podcast and the seasteading mission, go to seasteading.org/donate. If you'd like to learn more, read Seasteading: How Floating Nations Will Restore the Environment, Enrich the Poor, Cure the Sick, and Liberate Humanity from Politicians.